And now, for a presentation by Skift Research, please welcome Senior Research Analysts Wouter Geerts and Varsha Aurora.
Hi everyone, it's great to have you all here. My name is Wouter Geerts, and together with my colleague Varsha Aurora, we will be talking about a few recent highlights from reports that we've written about sustainable travel. So we've written 4 recent reports on sustainability, and we've taken quite a straightforward approach to this and quite a straight talking way of talking about our findings. For example, we looked at ESG filings from major airlines and major hotels to really see who are the laggards and who are the front runners in their industries. But more importantly, I think for today is some of the work that Varsha has done when it comes to destinations. And she's put a model together to calculate how the emissions from tourism are for 25 major destinations. And she'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But before that, I want to set the stage a little bit. Tourism is a growth industry, or at least it's always been that way. Up to last year, tourism grew almost unabatedly year over year. And even now in 2021, we're starting to see that probably the major dip that we had last year isn't going to be permanent. And what this growth in arrivals means is that greenhouse gases or carbon emissions from tourism have also grown. They now account for more than 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, transportation is a big part of these emissions. According to a recent study by Carbon Brief, it's about 50%, and airlines obviously make up a big chunk of that. When we looked at airlines, we could see that they still have a long way to go. They're in the crosshairs increasingly of governments, of the media, as well as of travelers. And even their own targets of reducing their emissions, they're nowhere near them. What we found is that before the pandemic, their emissions continue to increase, even though they had targets set to reduce them. So what we really need is a change in mentality. And I think this graph really shows what's happening here. When we look at loyalty programs, they're loved by avid travelers. They're heavily promoted by airlines. But according to our calculations, they're also extremely polluting. An average traveler that wants to reach the highest status tier at one of these major airlines will emit about between 15 and 26 metric tons of CO2. And that's more than the average American emits in an entire year on all their activities. And it's way more than the global average, than a global citizen emits. So we know there's a problem here, but who's responsible for changing it? And that's how we segue to destinations, the topic of today, because it's even more complicated when it comes to destinations. You're not just talking about an airline and a traveler and figuring out who's responsible. We're also now including DMOs, governments, lodging providers, local residents, and the list goes on and on and on. How do you manage all of these stakeholders, and how do you measure the impact that that tourism has on all of these stakeholders and on the natural environment? This is something that Varsha has looked in a little bit more, and she will discuss that now.
Hi all, and thanks for setting the stage, Wouter. As Wouter already mentioned, and I'm sure all of you will agree, tourism is a complex industry. Although tourism emissions have been quantified to an extent, but till date there is no concrete study on emissions at a country level. And in fact, there is no standard guideline to measure the same. To fill in this gap, Skift Research attempted to quantify domestic and international tourism emissions for select 25 countries, basis only publicly available data. The starting point of our approach was the relationship between expenditure and emissions. We believe that the two are directly proportional. You spend more, you use more resources from the value chain, and hence you emit more. Based on this, we correlated the tourist expenditure with the average household expenditure and income to create a tourist emission factor. As this chart shows, the domestic and international emission factors for the select 25 countries. Using this approach, this obviously takes into account only the onshore emissions, which is basically once the tourist is in the destination, and hence not including the transport emissions. For calculating the total tourist emissions, we later added the air transport emissions at a country level. Now, our report gives an elaborate account of the approach and our findings, but since we are limited on time today, I will quickly present to you a few key highlights from our research. The first being that the average international tourist emission factor for developing countries like Thailand, Philippines, India, and Indonesia was found to be 3, meaning that international travelers to these countries emit 3 times more as compared to the locals. This is evidently because the household expenditure in such countries per capita is much lower as compared to the tourist spend per day. Secondly, domestic emissions accounted for approximately 70% of the total tourist emissions for the selected countries, culminating into countries with significant domestic tourism sector like China, India, US, and Germany, topping the carbon footprint ranking. Another major finding was that the emissions from air transport for countries like UAE, France, and Netherlands, which are big tourist markets, but also major aviation hubs, contribute approximately 40% of total emissions from tourism. Now here, to understand the relevance of tourism emissions even better, we plotted the average percentage of emissions attributable to tourism against the country's GDP. In general, the countries which derive a substantial amount of their GDP from tourism and have a low percentage of tourism emissions might seem to be a little more sustainable as compared to its peers. But the goal here should be to have low absolute emissions and high economic contribution. However, there are caveats to this. For instance, as you can see in this chart, in absolute terms, which is reflected in the size of the bubbles, countries like US, India, and China, which actually emit the most, but are still sitting in the leftmost quadrant, because obviously their overall economies are much larger and tourism forms a very small part of their GDP and hence their emissions. So this matrix is therefore not very straightforward. Bottom left is best and top right is worst. It is more nuanced than that. It basically provides a relative snapshot, a relative positioning, and the level of sustainability in each country, and also can be seen as a guide for DMOs to make planned and strategic decisions. They basically can prioritize sustainability in their strategic planning and also the messaging they want to convey. So, for example, if you look at the chart, both Thailand and Argentina, they are both highly very dependent on tourism. But tourism emissions in Thailand are much higher than Argentina. And hence the pressure on Thailand from governments, locals, and tourists will be much higher. And hence the strategic nuances should be much aggressive in Thailand as compared to Argentina. Now, in this slide, to conclude, we think that these are the key factors that will determine the way forward to grow tourism sustainably. First of all, there's an urgent need to measure the full and actual impact of tourism. There is a need to implement a tourism carbon inventory at a country level so that areas of improvement can be identified and all stakeholders can work towards one common goal. Secondly, the definition of success in the tourism industry really needs to be revamped. Government needs to play the value over volume game and must link every tourism strategy to the emissions data. At present, what governments do is they link their strategic decisions to the impact on country's GDP. But to grow sustainably, the governments must set emission reduction targets for tourism businesses and also promote businesses which partake in various carbon offsetting schemes. Last but not the least, sustainability is the responsibility of all who is involved in tourism. But it is difficult for individual and micro level small businesses to make a huge impact. And also there's a high level of coordination required here. There's a clear need for central authorities like governments, global organizations like UNWTO, and large corporates to take a leading role here. However, at the same time, we can't deny the fact that the traveler needs to be more conscious and he needs to be more educated on making environmental friendly choices. Hence, the change has to be driven from both ends to align intent with action. So this way, we just gave you a very quick snapshot of our research on this rather very broad topic. For more details, please read our reports on the website. Thanks again for joining in and enjoy the rest of the summit.